So, welcome to Asset Finance Connect's series of podcasts on the European asset finance industry. I'm Richard O'Donoghue, and over the next few months, I'll be chatting with industry experts about the challenges and opportunities facing our industry in 2025 and beyond. All this is possible with the sponsorship of Alpha. We'll tell you a bit more about Alpha later in the podcast. So this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Huston of Vamos, and we're going to talk all things AI. Firstly, I should say it's a unique experience to have two Richards on a podcast or indeed at any meeting. So this is a real privilege to have you here today. But Richard, let's maybe just start. Quick introduction to yourself and also what does Vamos do?
I'm Richard Huston, Managing Director of Vamos. Very briefly, we're specialists in applied AI for financial services. So that means rather than focusing on training AI models, we're focused on helping businesses to actually get value out of the latest advances in AI. That means guiding them on AI strategy and governance, providing AI training, and also helping them with targeted AI technology solutions.
Great. And is AI something you've been involved in for a long time, Richard, or how did you get involved in this?
So it's only relatively more recently that I've started actively working with AI. My background is I've worked in technology for asset finance for about 13 years now. So most of that time was at Alpha. And at Alpha, I went through a variety of roles. I was a software developer, then I was an implementation consultant. I had the opportunity to work on some really big automotive projects out in the US for a couple of years. And more recently, I worked as a solution architect. And in my role as a solution architect, my primary role was working on implementation projects, but it was also understanding technology trends and understanding how that was going to impact Alpha's customers. So as soon as ChatGPT came out, and a lot of people, myself included, went to have a little play around with it, my first thought was this is very cool. My second thought was this must have an API. So for anyone who's not familiar with API, application programming interface, it just means how one computer or piece of software can talk to another. And I thought to myself, this must have an API. I must be able to go and have a play with this. So I started doing that and I started hooking it up to other things. So there's a voice generator tool called 11 Labs. And so very quickly I had played around and given ChatGPT a voice before I actually had one. And from there, I started working within Alpha on exploring what we could do with it, which led to various projects that I worked on at Alpha. And it was last year that I made the decision to start my own business because I kind of really strong interest in exploring what could be done further with this and exploring how I could help businesses in the industry, in the asset finance industry to take advantage of this technology.
Great. And look, I think so many things you said there, you've experienced in our industry, which is great. And you talked about applying AI and kind of use cases. And I guess that's kind of where I want to start, because I don't really know how to phrase this politely, but I'm kind of wondering with AI, is there hype or is there fatigue? Because we had a virtual conference back in January, and we asked people at that conference what they were interested in learning more about. And bottom of the list was the regulatory environment, which is kind of maybe, I think, fatigue more than anything else. And then AI was next. And I guess, interested in your perspectives, because also I've heard people say, is this going to be another blockchain? People talk about it and yeah, it gets used, but it doesn't get used to the extent that, maybe we anticipate or that justifies the incredible investments that are being made at the moment. So what are your thoughts about this? Fatigue, hype? Where do you sit?
So first of all, I definitely think it's true to say that, it's that the hype is even for me kind of exhausting. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who just find that exhausting and it becomes sort of thing you go, okay, not more AI stuff now. And I think the tricky thing, and I completely understand, why people might be fatigued with it. If you can't see the real value, and I think so far, most people, outside of a few special exceptions, most people haven't seen the real value yet, right? And that's kind of partly what inspired me to start what I'm doing now, what we're doing with Vamos, because I had seen what the technology is theoretically capable of, right? Like I'd seen the capabilities, but it's such a different thing to practically apply that in a business setting. And I'm only, honestly, it's only in the last couple of weeks that I'm seeing this kind of realization within like what I'd call the AI sphere. So, follow a lot of AI folks on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And there's this growing realization that, oh, hold on a minute, this AI stuff on its own is not, it's great, but it's, you know, it's just a tech building block, really. And the value in it only comes when you understand a business domain well enough to actually apply it and make it useful. So, you know, we've seen people realizing with DeepSeek that, oh, hold on, this is actually, you know, going to become maybe a cheaper, more commodity piece of tech, which is something we've kind of been talking to folks about for a while. Kind of treat it as just another tech building block and work out what it can do for you. So it's definitely overhyped because you've got a lot of people. If you haven't already been hearing about AI agents, I promise you, you're not going to stop hearing about them this year.
I can't wait.
Yeah, and I sort of apologize, sort of feel like secondhand guilt or something that I'm part of, you know, this hype train, which we try to cut through that. Like we try to go, okay, no, we're only going to talk about really practical things. We're going to show you really practical things. I always think it's better to show rather than tell. So we did an exercise last week. We were doing a workshop with a group of lenders, and we had the opportunity to kind of, well, we demonstrated some of our tech, but even just demonstrating Claude. So Claude is a competitor to ChatGPT. It's from a company called Anthropic. Anthropic is basically a group of people who left OpenAI a couple of years ago to start what they view as a more responsible version of OpenAI. I'm a big fan of Claude. We kind of use Claude as the backbone for a lot of what we build. It's a very robust, reliable model with similar performance to the models from OpenAI. But if you go and use Claude, you can do really cool things with it. So the demonstration I gave was I went and took the Court of Appeal judgment from the Motor Commission case, which is a very
popular topic in the UK. Maybe not so relevant to our European listeners, but go for it.
Yeah. So yeah, apologies to those outside of the world of UK motor finance, but it's a very dry 47-page legal judgment. But you know, it's had a lot of analysis here in the UK since it landed. And just to demonstrate what I could do with Claude, I gave it this PDF. I asked it for a summary and its implications for finance providers, which honestly, you know, if I compare it to some of the discussions we've had in Asset Finance Connect venues, it did a very good job summarizing it, to be honest, and covering the fiduciary duty. But also, I was able to then say, okay, now turn that into a presentation slide. And that's one of the tricks that Claude has up its sleeve. It can actually, it writes some code, but it can then run that code and present it to you right there. So you can get these really helpful visualizations based on whatever you're doing with Claude. And that is one of those, there are these little wow moments with any technology. And I find that when I show that to kind of business leaders, that's one of those wow moments because they didn't know that was capable. They know that ChatGPT is a chat interface and you can get it to write you a poem and that sort of stuff. But seeing a kind of more practical application, people start to realize what they might be able to do with this technology.
And I think, you know, you and I have spoken about this before at various events and it's use cases as the techies in us love to talk about. I mean, give us an example of what else is it capable of doing where maybe there's an aha moment. And specifically, if you can kind of give an example that's relevant to listeners in the asset finance industry.
So one of the areas we've been working on quite closely is how it can help when you have communications, you know, in any form coming from a customer, let's say email, and on the operations side, right, that can lead to any number of actions, you know, administrative actions on the operations side. It might be going and looking up some information, checking against some policy, making some modification to a contract. Could be anything along those lines. And there's a fair bit of, you know, administrative work there. And so we started exploring this concept last year and we presented it to a group of lenders at the Captives Forum. It was just a concept video, but the idea was using the AI, these latest models, to understand the email that has come in from the customer, to understand what the customer is trying to achieve, and to check against the company's policies and procedures and processes, and then to make intelligent suggestions. So that in its own is pretty useful. But the next step, it goes kind of one step further, is then if you can then integrate that with the back office system, and that's kind of what we're focused on working on right now, and we're building out the capability to do that with our product Lucero. If you can integrate with the back office system, you can make it really straightforward then to actually action those things as well. And so what previously might have taken, I don't know, you know, depends on the task, but could have been 10, 15, 20 minutes of going into the back office system, finding some piece of information, determining if you can proceed with some contract modification, can be dramatically shortened by having the AI summarizing, checking the policies and procedures, checking various rules, and then providing those intelligent suggestions. Now, one thing that's really important for us, and I think this gets lost a lot in the hype around AI, is at no point there are we trying to have the AI make any decisions on its own. Maybe one day the AI will be at that level of capability. But in my view, right now, it's not. And I don't think it's responsible to be kind of selling it as something that can be fully autonomous. I use this AI every day. I would not trust it to go and do stuff fully autonomously. It works with my supervision. And so that's sort of the approach here is we allow that tool to do some of the legwork in that administrative, kind of operations role, but still absolutely leaving the human in control. Not even, there's the phrase human in the loop, which I think is slightly insulting to the human. I don't think it's about being in the loop. I think it's about being in the driving seat. So that's kind of the approach we've taken. But I think if you look at things like that, you start to realize, and again, we did this exercise recently with some lenders, you start to analyze how much administrative work there is in various processes and how much of that is just look at this document, take this bit of information, do that kind of stuff. And that's what these AI models are very, very good at now. So you start to realize you can pinpoint pieces of those processes that are very admin heavy and target those.
I think one of the things I've heard somebody describe it as is it's almost like having a smart intern. You're not going to let the intern who has no context, no experience go and make the decision on their own, but they can bring all of the data to you and summarize it, and then you make the decision. And I guess, that kind of brings us on to this topic. You've mentioned keeping people involved, that ultimately the AI doesn't make the decision. And I guess that's sort of the concern around AI. It's the hallucinations. It's, frankly, will people lose their jobs on the back of it? I mean, again, where do you kind of stand around, or what's your thoughts on those sort of areas?
I think both of those are things that need to be taken really seriously. And again, I think with all the AI hype and a lot of people, pushing their new AI solutions to things, that often gets lost. So on the hallucinations piece, for example, it is a challenge with these large language models, but obviously as soon as they came out, people started trying to address that. And there's a technique that's used called retrieval-augmented generation, or RAG. And that basically means you don't ask the large language model to just give you an answer based on what it's been trained on, because it can combine different bits of information, make stuff up. That's the hallucination piece. Instead, you give it exactly the information that you want it to base the answer on. So in the example with that Court of Appeal judgment, I didn't ask it to give me the answers with no information. I gave it the PDF and said, based on this PDF, tell me the answer. And you find that when you do that, you can't completely eliminate hallucinations entirely, but you can reduce them to a negligible frequency. And then you kind of, over time, you keep improving that. On replacing people, I think, and I've kind of stressed it with what I said previously, we, at least at Vamos, we very much view AI as just another piece of technology that comes in to help people do their jobs. Now, it has some fantastical abilities in some regards. So taking your intern example, and we've kind of talked about this before, that intern model is a good way to think about it. And it's an extremely smart intern. You take these latest models, the things it can do, and it can read a 100-page document in seconds and stuff like that.
I hope you're not disparaging interns.
It's a magical intern, basically.
Intern. I like that.
That can read at a ridiculous pace and has. And you've got to think about it in another sense as well, that the kind of general knowledge it has comes from the fact that it's been trained on basically scooping up large portions of the internet. Now, there's rightfully people have been kind of challenging that because a lot of that content is copyrighted. So there's a whole bunch of lawsuits going on at the moment in the US from rights holders. So again, there's a bit of this move fast and break things mentality of some of these AI companies, which I don't necessarily agree with either. But in terms of thinking about these AI models and what they're able to do, they have this really broad knowledge because they've hoovered up the internet, and that includes things like Wikipedia and lots of articles that people have posted online. So you can kind of go to them for general knowledge on anything, and you don't rely on them as an expert. Like, that would be a mistake to go. And we've seen situations where lawyers tried to use them, and they cited non-existent cases. You don't rely on them as an expert, but as a first starting point, I frequently use it now. I got into gardening a lot last year, and I can now go and ask it just completely random questions that I could look up on Google, but then you kind of have to go and do a bit of trawling and digging through. And it's often a quick way to get a first pass answer, even if you then have to go and further verify things, which is...
I guess the proof, though, will be if all of your plants that you planted died, then there was an hallucination.
It's a great test, right? It's a great test.
Yeah, there's a real life case. What other thing? Listen, I know you mentioned gardening, and I know sustainability is something that's important to you. Again, you read a lot about these consume inordinate amounts of power. Again, how do you justify that?
Yeah. So, and this is something that, you and I have talked about, and I've talked to other people about as well, because I went to the extent of basically banning myself from flying in recent years. I would come to all the conferences and events around Europe by train and always tell people the long-winded train journey, which actually turns out to be very nice. It's quite a nice, if you have the time to do it, or you can fit it into your schedule, it actually becomes a really nice way to travel, and you see a lot more of the world. But so I took that really seriously, and then I did quite, as many other people, have concerns about the environmental impact of AI. And so I've been doing a bit more research into, or a bit more reading around this. And I think it's an interesting one because on the one hand, it's overstated to the impact. So on an individual basis, if you're using AI, the impact of that is really negligible compared to many of the other things you do in your day-to-day life. So you're probably using far more energy watching Netflix than you are using for ChatGPT or similar, just on a comparison. In fact, just us being on Zoom right now to record this is also probably using more energy than we would be using for ChatGPT. So on an individual basis, I don't think it's one of those things that, you need to cut out of your life or avoid doing. And yet, on a kind of global, systemic basis, the increase in demand for it is definitely going to drive, lots of new data centers, lots of new energy usage, increasing demands on water. Now that, the people building those data centers, and it's the likes of Google and Amazon and Microsoft who provide the cloud platforms, they have been working over recent years to try and find green and clean sources of energy. They say that they are still committed to doing that. I genuinely hope they kind of stick to that. And I think in certain regions, it's easier than others. It's easier in Europe than it is elsewhere for them to do that. It feels we go through this as a society when we kind of balance the costs and benefits of any technology. And if we were really making a cost benefit analysis, there's a lot of other things that you might then start questioning and saying we need to cut that. And actually we do say we need to cut those things out. I think AI offers so many potential benefits across so many areas that it's well worth, the increase in energy expenditure. And we just have to hope that we can balance that by using clean energy sources.
Yeah, and I think that's always the argument with a lot of technology is that productivity gains and benefits outweigh the cost. Now, a quick word about our sponsors, Alpha. As Richard mentioned, he worked at Alpha for many years, so he's very familiar with Alpha's SaaS platform, Alpha Systems. The latest version, Alpha System 6, supports origination, servicing, and collections in the asset finance industry. It uses AI and rules-based workflows to automate decision-making and increase efficiency for asset finance providers with tools like Alpha Decisioning, a credit decision engine that uses predictive AI to manage portfolio risk, and Ask Thea, a conversational AI chatbot for user support and guidance. Find out more about intelligent automation at alphasystems.com. Two things maybe to finish off with. Just DeepSeek. You kind of alluded to it earlier. It sounds like you think it's a relatively positive development because maybe it's going to, I hate to use the phrase, but maybe democratize the AI world. Is that a fair summary?
So I wouldn't say democratize. A lot of people throw that around in terms of AI, and I'm not sure it's a very helpful way of characterizing it necessarily. But I think what it indicates is that we are going to continue to see more companies building AI models and building highly capable ones, and we're going to continue to see the price dropping. And it's really interesting to sort of compare this progress to other technologies. I was thinking back over things like databases and stuff like that, or operating systems. In all of those technologies, you initially had a small handful of very well-heeled commercial providers of those technologies. But over time, all of those were then, reproduced and improved upon in open source, right? Whether that's with like operating systems like Linux, which now drive pretty much everything that runs in the cloud, or whether it's with databases, now a lot of people have moved to using open source databases. And that same trend is happening in AI. In fact, it already was happening. So DeepSeek kind of blew up by some combination of, media coverage and its app getting a lot of hype, and it probably scaring certain people that it's a Chinese company. Mm-hmm. But for sort of AI watchers, we were already monitoring. We were already kind of well aware of what DeepSeek had been doing over the last year or so, which was really good work, really good research work. And they're not the only ones. There's labs in France, in the UK, and in the US, and in China. In China, you have other players doing open source AI at a similar level, like Alibaba, which is like China's Amazon. Yeah. Although it seems to have generated a lot more media attention for a number of reasons. And some of that is some of the numbers as well. So that 5.5 million in training costs is a very misleading number. And I don't think DeepSeek were trying to mislead anyone. They just gave that in their research paper as a stat, that's how long, that's the equivalent cost of how long they spent training the model, which is great, right? They did it very cost effectively. But the total cost of doing this is all the researchers, all the hardware, all of that. And that's the hardware alone is probably in the region of $500 million to $1 billion of GPUs, right? Units. So I think it's kind of blown up because of maybe a bit of media misunderstanding about exactly what it meant and how it fits into the wider landscape. But at the same time, I quite like that people are now getting the message that, oh, okay, so this AI stuff is not just ChatGPT. Actually, there are other companies working out there. It's progressing. It's getting cheaper. It's getting more available, because that is the right message. That is where it's going to go. And it's then going to become more like a commodity. If you compare where AI was a couple of years ago, it's like if I wanted to make a meal and I had to grow all of the ingredients in my garden, which I don't think I would succeed at. But now, if you want to make that same meal, you just go and buy them from the supermarket. Like, you have so many providers making it so readily available, whether that's on the major cloud platforms like Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS. It's so much more readily available than it was even just a few years ago. And that's the trend that I think is really interesting and is going to continue, because that now makes it so much easier for people like us at Vamos, for example, to start building tools specialized to our industry in a really cost-effective way. I can say for certain, I could not have done this 3 years ago. The stuff that we're building now, if I'd wanted to do 3 years ago, I'd have had to go and, have some specialist machine learning engineers, build a whole bunch of custom solutions. And now this technology is available as a commodity, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's comparable, as you say, to the cloud and the way people just spin up businesses now on cloud-based platforms that they couldn't have done 10 years ago, for example. Let's finish on this one. You mentioned gardening. We're not sure. We'll know in the spring whether it's nice, bad advice. But in your personal life, what's your favorite use of AI? Or tell us something that we're going to have an aha moment and go, I didn't realize you could use it for that.
I will tell you one of my favorite aha moments. And it came from one of those train trips across Europe. Where I had a changeover in Paris for a few hours, and I just went to go and get lunch somewhere near the train station, and was presented with a menu. Like, I can speak French reasonably well, but menus often really confuse me in France. So, and this is maybe about a year ago, actually, I think, or more. And I just took out the ChatGPT app and kind of pointed the phone camera at the menu, took a picture, and I didn't just ask it to translate it. What I asked was, give me some recommendations, because, it can do much more than just translate. Yes, it's actually very good at translating. In fact, these large language models were originally designed for translating, and then they were just found to be useful at other stuff. And then I could tell it what I was in the mood for. And it would talk to me. I hadn't even entered the restaurant yet, and I had an advisor on the menu giving me, saying, oh, well, this is this. Because, some of these dishes I wasn't even particularly familiar with. And so I had the opportunity to have this conversation where its general knowledge was really useful in explaining to me what I might like on the menu, depending what mood I was in. And that for me, that was the first time I'd done that. And it was just a very incidental thing in my day. And it just kind of felt like magic. So that moments like that are really impressive with it.
Oh, I like that. So we're back to magic. Somewhere in the middle, we talked about magical interns.
What's the quote? Any sufficiently advanced technology becomes indistinguishable from magic. And there's lots of things in our daily life that we've gotten used to and take for granted, but are basically, magic. And it's another one of these where I have these moments where it sort of feels like that. And that's how you know that, okay, this is a technology. Comparing it to crypto, you mentioned crypto and blockchain earlier. That has never had that impact on my life, other than a brief moment of madness during lockdown where I bought a bit of Bitcoin. It's never had an impact on my life in any regard like that. So although I think blockchain is a cool piece of technology that has some very niche uses, this AI thing is dramatically different because it can help me out in all kinds of ways. But you have to start exploring it. You have to just start playing around with it. That's kind of the message I say to everyone. If they haven't already, go and have a look, not just at ChatGPT, but have a look at Claude as well, and just have a play around with it. The only way I learned, a lot of what I learned about what it can do is just from trying things. And I do that constantly.
And I think that's a great way to finish, because it's like any technology, until you start using it and seeing what its capabilities are, you really never get the full benefit of it. And I guess people are intimidated by it, or they don't have practical use cases. And I guess as the industry evolves and we talk about use cases and the stuff that you're doing with some customers, but that other people are doing as well, then it's more likely that it gets embraced and we start to see the real benefits of it. So look, it's been an absolute pleasure, as always. I think, I've picked up a couple of things that I didn't know. It's funny, all of you AI guys talk about Claude. It seems to be the one that everybody seems to use. I've actually started using it myself, and I do find it very good. I find the hallucinations are very funny, and it'll sometimes tell you exactly the opposite of what it told you 5 minutes before if you push it hard enough. So there's a lot to be done to kind of, I guess, get AI out and being widely accepted. But I think there are a lot more use cases coming, and I'm sure we'll explore those going forward over the coming months and at the European Leaders event in Amsterdam in May. So Richard, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll meet again at some conferences, and you'll enlighten me with some other use that I can put AI to in my day-to-day life. So thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Asset Finance Connect and sponsored by Alpha. I really enjoyed speaking with Richard Huston. While he's a big advocate for AI, he also acknowledges that work needs to be done to truly get the benefits that AI can potentially deliver. If you've enjoyed this episode, look out for future episodes in the weeks ahead. Also, if you have ideas for future episodes, drop a note to the team at Asset Finance Connect. Thanks for listening.